I think we're going to have a very interesting and very important panel. Our topic is measuring situations and outcomes concerning children outside of family care and children in alternative care arrangements. I would say subtitled, Out of Sight, Out of Mind, which I think is the situation of the vast majority of children in this world who are outside of family care. They aren't even enumerated. We have wildly inaccurate and varying estimates of how many there are, where they are. We know far too little, and they tend to be out of sight, out of mind. So measurement of how many there are, what are their circumstances, why are they there, is extremely important. So our first panel presenter, Fred Wilson, asked me to be very brief because we could go on at some length, but I just want to say that Dr. Wilson, is Senior Research Fellow and founding staff member at Chapin Hall, University of Chicago. Some of you may well know his name because he was the lead author on a rather significant paper, Adapting a Systems Approach to Child Protection. And Deborah Dow was also one of the authors on that paper. The best description of what we mean by a child protection system, a term that has been in recent years. And they've done a great service by saying, well, what is this thing we're talking about? So with that, I just want to turn things over to Fred.
So I'm gonna despite the slide that was there ahead of time, it's largely the same thing, but I came back to the title of this particular section, Measuring Situations and Outcome. And then I want to focus a little bit on the public health impact of the law. It's really a question of what, when you have the data, what do you do with it? How do you analyze the data to make it better, and provide some examples. I was asked to sort of talk a little bit about the status of data collection in the U.S., this issue of out of sight, out of mind. I would have to say that in the U.S., kids in out-of-home care are not out of sight. They are out of mind, but they're not out of sight, which is an interesting tension because we have lots of data and the capacity of child welfare systems at all levels, from the very top to the line workers, interacting directly with children and families. There's very little capacity to actually use the data to support decision making. It's a lot better than it was years ago, and I'll say a little bit about that. But they are not out of sight, they are out of mind, and I think that's one of the tensions. I too, like my colleague Deb Darrow, I've been around for a while. When I first got started, the information about kids in out-of-home care was kept on 3x5 cards. That's literally true. That I was there when the transition to computerized electronic records took place in the mid-70s through the early 80s, in terms of the early efforts to do that. And prior to that, it was done on 3x5 cards in filing cabinets and the little boxes that contained those cards. That's how we kept track of kids. And so, in a sense, I'm reflecting on our experience as it relates to what's taking place in low and middle income countries, also in some of the in the well-developed countries of Western Europe. Some places, even though they've got the money to do it, they do not do a very good job of keeping track of kids who are placed in out-of-home care for a whole variety of reasons, and I'll go through some of them. One is the role of resources. If you want the data, you have to spend the money. There's just no other way around it. Collecting that much data takes resources, and you either spend it or you don't. And if you spend it wisely, you'll have something that allows you to, at least, that they're not out of sight, they're no longer out of sight. The challenge is that it'll be even more money to spend on the out-of-mind part of the problem. So how do you bring the data into the perception of what's going on, and then what do you do about it to use what you know about the kids and families to do a better job of serving them. The role of politics, is important for a whole host of reasons. What we've observed in the U.S. with regard to how well do they do it, it's a question of political will, pure and simple. There's a lot of nice ways to say about it, but if the politics don't want to keep track of kids, you don't keep track of kids. And the first level of advocacy is a commitment to knowing where these kids are. And if you don't have a system that does that, it's because the politics aren't working to assemble the resources to do the job, because there is no technical reason why you cannot do a very good job of keeping track of kids in out-of-home care. But it's money, and that's obviously a huge issue in particularly low and middle income countries. Amassing the resources, particularly when it's set alongside all the other competing interests like services for kids. Do you spend the money to keep track, or do you spend the money to provide services? And I would argue that the decision is too often easily made on the side of let's put it into services, because at the end of the day you've got to figure out whether or not you're wasting that money. And a lot of the money does get wasted, and you don't know that unless you're actually keeping track. So the social accounting, the fiscal accounting are all very important aspects of it. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of the transition in the U.S. to the sort of modern era is the role of science and best practices. We tend to think of best practices as something you use to describe what people interacting directly with children and families need to pay attention to, and that the rest of it is somehow immune from this notion of best practices. But there are ways to keep track of people. There are a lot of ways to keep track of people. Some of them very good, and some of them very poor, from the clarity of the signal you get back about the system you're using. So it's all about, the analogy I like to use is you use the data as a mirror that you hold up to look at yourself. And just like mirrors, you can find a mirror that will make you look 10 feet tall and 1 foot wide. You can go to a mirror that will make you look 10 feet wide and 1 foot tall, or you can go to a mirror that accurately reflects what's going on. And we make lots of choices that have to do with choosing the first two types of mirrors, and don't invest enough in how do we clarify and understand the image we're getting back. And that's a significant part of the investment that takes place. And actually the rules for how those mirrors should be assembled come out of science. There's no other way to say, I want to hold up a mirror to my system that is as distortion-free as we can make it. So I have an accurate image of what's taking place, not only from the perspective of the micro level details of the child's life, the family's life, but at the macro level of the system and the interaction between the two. And science is the body of knowledge we have that is the best suited for clarifying what exactly are the best practices for assembling those mirrors. So what about this role of science? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of frameworks. And the framework that I'm going to talk specifically about is how we think about using this data. So I'll say a little bit about the data. And then I want to come to two examples at the end of my presentation that is sort of inside this box. John mentioned our work on systems. I want to talk a little bit about foster care as a system. It is, in fact, a system. That may be self-evident to people in the room, maybe not. I've been in meetings where people have said, well, we always talk about the foster care system, but it's not really a system. Well, there just simply couldn't be anything further from the truth. And so I want to talk a little bit about policy effects, sort of how do we think about, or how do I think about detecting the effect of policy on the lives of kids. And I'm going to use a particular example of adoption. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about some work we're doing on what I'll call multi-level linked interventions, or linked multi-level interventions. I haven't figured out whether it's a linked multi-level intervention or a multi-level linked intervention, but you'll get the basic idea, I hope. So the importance of frameworks and the data. So we have the placement records of 3 million kids who experienced out-of-home care sometime in the last 30 years in the U.S. Now, The time periods are jagged. Not all states started collecting data at the same time. They all basically collect the same data. Some do a better job in a more sort of holistic picture, but they all collect basically the same data. We know when they came into out-of-home care. We know what kind of placement they experienced. We know how long they were there. We know whether or not they moved around. We know their age, their race. We sometimes know a little bit about the family. We know where they come from within a given state, so we can isolate them or place them in an ecological context. All of which is to say, through all of this time, right, 30 years in some cases, almost 40 years in some cases, kids of all developmental ages, 0 to 18, all manner of outcomes. They went home, they ran away, they went to a juvenile justice facility, they were reunified, they went to relatives, they went to adoption. We know all of these things, and what we're trying to understand is, well, what was the role of the system in shaping their lives? And so we have to have a framework for doing that. And this is where I came back to the sort of the title of this this session, which was about situations and outcomes. And I love the word situation because it's a perfect international word. It is as devoid of meaning as it is full of meaning, right? It's devoid of meaning because situations, but it's full of meaning because you heard it this morning about all the different contexts that kids are involved in. What's the word that you would describe that is not exclusionary and is totally inclusionary, right? Situations is a good starting point. And so what's the connection between situations and kids' outcomes? There's got to be some way we understand those situations. And I think that what we'll eventually settle on, if we haven't already, is the notion of a person in a place and a time. And then from that, we have to create a narrative that talks about who they are. And then ultimately, I think, and this is sort of a policy issue in the US, whether we see well-being as a point process, something you say about somebody today, how are they doing? Or is it a process through time? It's a trajectory. So two people at the same place today could be at very different places a year from now. How would that affect the way you thought about them today? Does how you think about them today, in what way is it dependent on what you know about them in the future as a way to understand their narrative? So we need a way to grapple with all that. So this is sort of what we look at in terms of placement as a situation. And so what you've got here, see if I can do this without messing it up. Group care, foster families, relative care, and home is the placement context. It's the household that they're living in. So they could be at home, they could be in relative care, they could be in foster family care, they could be in one of any number of forms of group care, and those could be institutions. You can elaborate or not, as the case may be. And of course, the setting or the situation in which a child is living changes over time. So we would expect a kid who's in foster care all the time to sort of fall into this row at the top, or into group care all the time. If they're in foster family care all the time, they're going to fall in this row. And the columns are differentiated by the fact that these are developmentally homogeneous groupings of kids. We want to understand something about the narrative that attaches back to who they are from a developmental perspective. And they're going to travel through time through this three-dimensional space: person, time, and place. And at each one of these boxes, let's call them situations, we want to know something about what's happening. So we want to know something about the child, their biographical story, their own personal narrative, and it might consist of their physical health, their social emotional well-being, their cognitive development, their experience and skills. Some people might call that human capital. We might also want to know something about their own reflections on their own life, depending upon how old they are. In addition to who's in the box, in terms of that narrative, we can say something about the context that is the box. And that consists of their community, the home, the family, and then ultimately the caregiver. We heard a lot about caregivers earlier today and the important role they play in making the quality of this box such that the next time we look for where that child is, they're going to be in a better box, defined in some manner of speaking. And I don't want to trivialize it, by simply calling it a box, but there has to be I like to work with physical representations of the data that we're working with so that we know how to study what's going on, the role of the framework. The other thing we'll also be able to say about the box is what services are they getting? Are they getting child welfare services, health, mental health, education, daycare? You can fill in the blanks. But that's also something that characterizes what's going on inside the box. And then, of course, there's the issue of maltreatment history, and you could define that as narrowly or as broadly as you'd like to. But the idea from a trajectory perspective is, how do services come to bear on the experiences today such that it influences where we find the child the next time we're able to look? So we're applying services all the time to move kids from group care to family care to relative care back to the home. So that's a progression through this state space that allows us to understand who these kids are. And by grouping them as occupants of the same sort of address, we can see how people who are in the same place disperse through the system and understand how things are influenced. So this is a framework that we're using to sort of use the administrative data to come to some understanding as to, does public policy have a positive impact? Do programs, interventions have a positive impact on the lives of kids in out-of-home care? So let's look at two examples. Adoption and foster care is much more common in the U.S. than it is in a lot of other countries. That's a culturally relevant statement. There are a lot of reasons why adoption is so important in the U.S., but it has to do with the system in the U.S. is very concerned about who holds parental rights. It's less of a concern internationally, but in the U.S. it is the fundamental question, because you can't get to the best interests of the child unless you've set aside parental rights. It's the only way into the family. The state cannot reach in, independent of parental rights, and ask a question about how well is the child doing. That's the parent's job. And if the parents are doing the job adequately enough, it's very hard for the state or any of its representatives to reach inside the family sphere and make judgments about how well it's going. It's a problem. But it is a culturally defined problem, largely as a result of being in a pluralist society where there are many cultures, where the culture around raising children is likely to clash. And in some sense, it's protective of culture, because it says people in the dominant culture cannot reach inside the family and make judgments about the quality of child rearing that may be patterned after cultural practices that are not accepted by the dominant culture. That's one of the reasons why parental rights are so important. Even though, as a general phenomenon in the U.S., adoption is more important than it is in a lot of other places around the world, state policy in the U.S. varies significantly. So the question is, what's the relationship between state policy, because all of the policies are designed to make it easier to have adoption happen. That's the goal. Lawmakers are not working hard to make it harder to adopt, they're making it easier to adopt. For the most part. It's not entirely 100% true, but at the end of the day we want to understand, how do these sort of fine manipulations of policy translate into differences in adoption rates and the presumption that adoption is a good thing. So as it relates to adoption, as we think about the measurement problems, and this applies to whether it's reunification, guardianship, really any outcome, reentry to foster care. 8 minutes, all right, that should be good. So the two measures are, how likely is it to happen? And what's the timing? When does it happen? Relative to when the child came into out-of-home care, when does adoption take place? Now, show of hands. Would you say the percentage of kids who get adopted a month after being placed in out-of-home care is high or low? Low. Because there's a lot of work you got to do before you can set aside the parental rights and open the door to adoption. So at the beginning we expect it to be very low, but after a period of time we would expect it to increase. So what we want to do in the data is we want to see whether or not that pattern actually shows up in the data, and that's what what I'm going to show you. The issue here is that why it's so important is that if adoption confers developmental advantages to kids, then when and how frequently or how likely it is to happen is a really important question. Because if it takes a long time for kids to cash in on those developmental benefits, the likelihood that all of the benefits will be conferred is delayed by the delays embedded in the process. So policy should try to make it happen faster. And more likely, particularly among kids, where at the end of the day it's not going to matter. The likelihood of reunification is next to nothing. So state policy, interestingly enough, varies in the sense that some state policies target the likelihood. So they're trying to make it more likely, and the way they do that is they cast a big net. They say these are the kids who, without too much work, you can regard as eligible for adoption. And then the second way that state policy vary is they target the timing. And that is, if you've been in care for so many months in a row, then you automatically can go to the adoption track. So they're saying, 10 months, 12 months, 18 months. Once you hit that barrier, then the thing. And so they're moving that back and forth in an effort to accelerate adoptions. And the interesting policy conundrum is that those two things are often confused. People will say, well, if you adopt slowly, you must not adopt very many. And if you adopt quickly, you adopt a lot. But the truth is they're unrelated, or they can be unrelated. You can get both at the same time, or you can do a lot of adoptions, just do them very slowly. Or you can do a lot of adoptions and do them very quickly. It's an empirical question as to what's actually taking place, and then how that relates to public policy. So, this is your typical adoption process. Remember, we talked about it's not very likely early on, so we'll just call this the rate. It's not very likely early on, and then as time passes, you get this uptick in the rate, and then there's this sort of steady increase, and then it bends off, slows down, and this is reunification. And you'll see that it starts off very quickly, and then in time it literally peters out. And you'll notice that the change in the rate is simultaneous. These processes are mirror images of each other. And the thing that we're going to be concerned about is, well, when does this actually take place? Because that's when the effort to adopt kids becomes more effective. That's when, for the effort provided, the rate at which they produce adoptions is going up, and it's going up very rapidly. But then it slows down. And here, reunifications, people are working on reunifications right from the get-go. It happens a lot early on, but after a while, once the easy kids to reunify have been sort of passed through the system, then the ones that are left behind, they're harder to get reunified. And what happens is it slows down. The process itself slows down, and it converts to adoption, and it converts to a period of time when adoption is very fast. And so we're interested in that period when that happens, and we're also interested in how high this line goes, because that's the likelihood. This is speed or timing. This is likelihood. 3 minutes. I've got 2 timekeepers. My reputation must precede me. So here are adoption rates by states. I picked out sort of 4 prototypical, 3 prototypical, and then the average rate. So the average rate is right here. And you can see that these states differ very much with respect to, well, when is the period where the rate of adoption accelerates? You can see that it starts at different points in different states. You'll also notice that in this state, it's very late, and it never really speeds up like it does in the other places. So early timing, high probability. That would be this state right here. Now you know why I'm not a brain surgeon. That's early timing, high probability. The next one is late timing. See, they don't kick in until a little bit later in the time the kid's been in care. But the rate of increase matches and is, in some respects, sustained. They don't quite get to the probability, but because they start late. And then we have late timing, low probability. The uptick takes place very late, and they never get many kids adopted. So they're both slow and unlikely to take place in that particular state. So how does this relate to state policy? So we're looking now specifically at infants. More than half of all the adoptions in the United States take place with infants. They're not infants when they get adopted, but more than half of the kids who get adopted in the U.S. started foster care in the first year of life. After that, the probability of adoption goes down by 50%. So we thought, well, let's take a look at this particular population. And we've grouped now more than 20 states. And we've created a simple little scale that combines the timing policies that look at the timing and the probability. And we've said states with a 2, they're on the low end of both of those scales. 2 to 3, and then 4 are the states that have policies that favor both early timing and high probability. And we're looking to see whether or not these combinations of laws create anything. So what do we got? So by now you know how to read these graphs. So we're interested in the uptick and whether or not it's sensitive to policies. And so indeed it is. It does group. The black and the blue start earlier, and then there's a nice uptick, but then they taper off. So they start quicker, but they slow down more so. The red and the purple, hard to see that that's purple, they start together, and then the red, they have in a sense the weakest adoption policy. They peter out the most. And then you have the states that have the strongest adoption policy. They don't start quickly, but they wind up with the highest probability. Right? So now what we're in a position to do is look at the actual configuration of policies and say, well, if the states that follow this configuration, if the states that follow this configuration were to adopt these policies, would we see the effect play out in future adoptions? So we get a chance to sort of model the policy effects and say it would be worth, to execute these policies, it's going to take capacity. Judges, caseworkers, the decision-making capacity to say this child is ready. So those policy changes will require resources. The question is, what is the return on the investment? If we move this adoption trajectory to this, basically the difference between these two lines, you can monetize that difference. You can state the value, because these are care days used. These are kids lingering in the system. Each day in the system costs money. And if you can change how long kids stay in out-of-home care because you've managed the adoption process in a different way, you can monetize the magnitude of that effect and compare it to the cost of actually implementing the underlying policy and the operational consequences. So I know I'm running out of time. So I'll deal with the multi-level linked interventions. So we are trying to, as the earlier panels suggested, positive relationships with adults are protected. We're working to improve the quality of interaction between adults and children in the out-of-home care system. Includes caseworkers, bio-parents, and foster parents. There's no group of people who spend more time with kids in out-of-home care than foster parents. If you can lift the quality of that interaction by even a little bit, there's so much of that interaction taking place that a little bit of change in the quality could dramatically change outcomes. As opposed to a few kids get this service, a few kids get that service, that might be beneficial, but the question is, compared to improving the quality of all the interaction that occurs between adults, and focusing on that in addition to what are the interaction effects. But part of the issue is that there's a misalignment of fiscal incentives. This is the way the system operates, is not well aligned with systems getting better. It's a huge problem. We don't talk much about it, a little bit more in the U.S. these days, but it's how you purchase the services, particularly if you're dealing with NGOs. What's the fiscal arrangement? What services are you buying? And if they change the services they're buying, what happens to the money? If you've got NGOs that are investing a lot in out-of-home care, and you decide you want to provide that care in-home, it's the big problem in institutions. All the money's tied up in the institutions. You want to provide more support, you're either going to run two systems at the same time, or you're going to take the money out of the institutions. Figuring out how to do that is a fiscal problem, not a clinical problem. It has implications for how you manage clinical work, but if you don't solve the fiscal problem, good luck. And so we're trying to deal with that. It's a problem in the U.S. And then, as I was just talking about, the quality of work is a risk factor. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to buy better quality work on the part of the workforce. So these are just some of the things that as we think about sort of the framework and how do you make outcomes better, we've got policy work and we've got interventions, and we're trying to link across different levels in the system so that they're working together, as opposed to a clinical intervention that is essentially ignorant of the fiscal dynamics present in the system. And you're basically, the way it works in the U.S., if you want to get better outcomes and you're working with NGOs, you're asking the NGOs to destabilize themselves, because the better they get, the less money they get, and that's not a recipe for success. So let me stop there.
The title of this presentation is quite long, Enumerating Children Outside of Family Care and Measuring Separation in Emergencies, and that's because I was trying to capture two different strands of work in which I and a number of colleagues at Columbia and beyond are engaged. Ultimately, the goal of both of these strands of work are to create comprehensive data systems for children outside of family care in developing contexts and in emergency situations, to both measure and monitor trends over time, ideally to be able to track reduction goals at the national level, or reunification or alternative care success rates in emergency situations, and to spark and inform programmatic and policy responses. I had hoped that I would be able to talk really, really fast and be able to cover both projects, but ultimately realized that was a futile attempt. So I'm just going to mention the first strand of work, which is around developing national guidelines to help governments be able to track, and sort of maybe one way to think of this is a mix or a DHS model for children outside of family care, so children who are not being captured in household settings. The guidelines can be found online, and we will be piloting the guidelines in Cambodia in the coming year. But because we don't yet have data on that pilot, I decided to focus on our second strand of work, which actually has some results that we can share and begin to talk about and think about a little bit. So this piece of work is focusing on measuring separation and an accompaniment in emergencies. And I'm very lucky that in the room today, we pretty much have representatives. We have our donor here, we have members of our advisory board here, we have researchers who are in the field. So I will likely be calling on many other folks in the room to help respond to questions as well. But this really came out of a call for, when we know in emergencies, rapid onset emergencies, that a lot of children are separated from their families. The rules that have kind of governed our work for a long time have been this sort of 5% rule of thumb that somebody came up with, or some set of people came up with for years, that we anticipate that about 5% of children will be separated in an emergency. But that's really not proven. There's really no science or data behind that. And so this was an attempt to try to go beyond that and see if we can come up with some better estimates to help inform programming, advocacy, and policy. For those of you who are involved in emergency work, you know these definitions well, but I thought I would put them up here for folks who are not so involved in child protection and emergencies work. Separated children are defined as children who have been separated from both parents or from their previous legal or customary primary caregiver, but not necessarily from other relatives. whereas unaccompanied children are children who have been separated from both parents and other relatives and are not being cared for by an adult who, by custom or law, is responsible for their care. So there were really 3 strands of work that, that this project sets out to try to undertake. The first is actually not listed up here. It's a projection or modeling tool, which is being led by Johns Hopkins University. And the idea is to try to have some data so that when an emergency hits, we know in day 2 and day 3 to have some rough estimate of what we anticipate the level of separation might be. So that piece of work is a separate strand, which I'm not going to talk about today. The other 2 pieces I will try to cover. One is a population-based estimation tool. So this is really envisioned to be a tool that can be implemented 2-3 months after an emergency hits to try to get a robust estimation of the burden of separation and unaccompaniment due to an emergency. And the third objective was to develop a community-based surveillance tool. So something that could remain in communities and could continue to track separation over time. And we know that secondary separation is a huge issue. So after the initial emergency hits, there's an initial amount of displacement and separation. And over time, as other stressors may hit families and communities, there may be additional separation from livelihoods or from many other causes. So this is a mechanism that is meant to be able to track and pick up on some of those potential patterns, and if severe enough, could actually trigger, again, the need for a broader population activity, estimation activity. So the tools were piloted this summer in the Congo, in the DRC, in Nyiragongo and Goma territories. And I'm going to start with the population-based network sampling approach. For both of these tools, the first step was some formative qualitative research to try to understand where unaccompanied and separated children tended to be. Did they tend to be found in households, or did they tend to be found in residential care facilities or on the streets? And so qualitative mapping was undertaken with formerly unaccompanied and separated children, with key informants and others to help guide the tools and make sure they were appropriate for this setting. Ultimately, for the most part, we did hear that children were found in homes, and rolled out a version of a household survey that involved network sampling. And so the concept behind this is that a respondent was asked to talk not only about the family composition and the children who had come before and after the emergency in her household, but also to talk about what was happening in her 2 closest neighbors' households, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The estimation activity employed a cluster sampling approach. We can talk a little bit more about this. Normally, you would randomly select clusters from your territory in order to be able to generalize out to the entire territory. Because of security concerns, we were not able to do this. So our findings were not representative to the entire territory, but just to the areas where we sampled. The team was made up of 14 local data collectors who underwent 6 days of training and spent 3 weeks collecting data in the field from 20 different sites, which included 16 villages and 4 camps for internally displaced people. Within each site or cluster, 25 to 28 interviews were conducted, and again, each interview asked about that particular household and the family patterns and movement and the 2 closest neighboring households. So I've shown a picture, which Hani kindly provided, to try to give you a sense of how the survey went. The respondent was asked to talk about who in the family was living in the household, or who was residing in the household in the present day. And for each individual, they were given a sort of baseball card little piece of paper that the interviewer filled out, which marked information on age and what else is on there? Relationship to the head of household. And through this process, the interviewers began to ask and to parcel out, were all of these children, for all the children that were identified, were they there, have they been there since the emergency, or did they come after the emergency? And the recall period was the M23 takeover in Goma in December of 2012. So through this process, they were able to track and separate out those children who I think were considered new arrivals since the emergency. And that triggered additional sets of questions that then asked about their care arrangements and a whole set of other things. The interviewers also then asked about the relationship and the composition of the household before the emergency, to try to understand whether there were actually children living in the household before the emergency who were not found in the household in the present day. And so those were indicated through baseball cards of a separate color, but again indicated separation or an accompaniment. And for each child that was identified as being separated or unaccompanied, information was collected on their age, sex, the causes of separation, and their care situation if known. So I just have some very, very preliminary results that one of our researchers was kind enough to run this weekend so that I could share something with you. So the prevalence of separation overall, if we just look for a moment at the household, the main household that the respondent was providing information on, the prevalence of separation was close to 9%. So again, just thinking back to that sort of 5% rule that actors often have to act on because they don't have that much. We know already that if this is the true prevalence of current separation, we're really underestimating and the amount of services and funds needed to respond. Non-camp setting was 9%. In-camp setting was quite a bit lower. And unaccompaniment, which was a segment of the separation prevalence, was in the household identified to be close to 2. We are still doing a lot of analyses on household 2 and 3, and so I think you'll have to stay tuned for a lot more information on this and how well the neighborhood method component actually worked. Overall, it seems like the size of the household was underestimated by 1 person compared to the original household, and as a result, generally the results are a little bit lower. So the precision is somewhat lower than the original household. There is a reason that this is higher, and this is the prevalence of unaccompaniment. Because of ethical reasons, in our household sample, we would not interview child-headed households. And so those, by definition, would come up as unaccompanied children, but they were systematically excluded for ethical reasons and were picked up here in household 2 and 3. The first slide I showed you was in terms of arrivals, those who were in the house since the emergency happened. But in tracking departures, we also see pretty high rates. Separation rates were 5.46. The unaccompanied rates in this case look very low, but that is actually because there is a huge amount of missing data. So most of the time when a child left a household and the respondent was asked who is caring for this child, the answer was, we don't know. So we know they're separated. It is very, very, very likely they were also unaccompanied, but we couldn't parse that out because they didn't know who the caretaker was. So a couple of limitations from this initial pilot. As I mentioned, this is really intended to be a tool that's used after an acute onset of an emergency. And of course, the DRC has been in conflict for a very, very long time. In this case, the recall period was 20 months, and so that very likely affected both how well a person might remember the family composition in their own household, but especially trying to recall and remember what's happening in their neighbors' households. As I mentioned, the sampling of clusters was not able to be random because of security concerns. I've mentioned again the household one, child-headed households were systematically excluded. And finally, I just want to touch on this piece, the technical expertise. It was originally envisioned when we were all together in New York talking about what we wanted in an estimation tool, that this could be a tool that could be given to Save the Children, that could be given to the IRC, that could be given to PAMI, the local organization that's working on reunification, and that they could carry this out without a lot of technical support. The reality is this is a pretty complex survey to try to roll out with a lot of intricate details. We've tried to simplify it a bit with the baseball cards and the mapping, but even so, it required quite a bit of expertise and support. We're looking with the adaptation of potentially making it easier to use through tablets that automates a lot of the processes, but that of course brings a whole host of other technical issues and needs. So that's sort of to be determined, but a potential limitation of the tool. I'll just spend a couple of minutes, I know I don't have too much time left, talking about the other piece, which was the community-based surveillance tool, which is a cell phone-based tool, which is, again, to track ongoing, 3 minutes, great, ongoing measurement of the trends and basic characteristics of unaccompanied and separated children over time. 10 of the 20 sites where we rolled out the population estimation were selected to also be surveillance sites. And within each site, 3 focal points were selected. It tended to be the chief of the village, somebody who was locally elected by the community, and a member of a youth group or a women's group. So the processes differed a little bit, and Eva, who is running this process, can speak more about that if you have other questions. But generally that process seemed to work well. So each individual would have a cell phone. They underwent a common training, and there was a focal point, PAMI, who was working on reunification issues, who actually was able to follow up on cases of separation that were identified. Every week, the focal points would send in information on the cases of separation that they had identified that week, which was for every child, they would enter a 6-string code that included information on age, sex, separation versus unaccompaniment, arrival versus departure from a community, cause of separation, and current care situation. And Eva and other members of the team would go out and verify that these cases were real and were accurate. Just to give you a few results, and this data is actually ongoing, so this surveillance program will last through October, I believe. So we'll continue to populate these graphs, but this gives you a sense of the unaccompanied reports by week. And you can see disaggregated by gender. The girls' patterns seem to fluctuate a lot more than the males, which is interesting. And by age group. So I'll just end by saying, this again this won't give you prevalence rates. This is really an ongoing system to try to track and see what new issues may be emerging that would potentially trigger the need for another estimation exercise. The data quality is highly dependent on having good, well-trained, responsible focal points. And even though we were really lucky in the DRC to have a partner who could go and follow up on cases, this is not necessarily going to be realistic in many emergency settings. And in fact, part of the goal would actually be to try to have surveillance efforts in those areas that can't be reached at the moment, or where there isn't funding for current programming, to try to track and determine trends of separation, to potentially lobby for funding to move into those areas. So that's a question that we wrestled with a lot in terms of ethics in response to the ethical obligation to respond to an identified case. The first week we had about 100 cases, I think, and about 98 of those were old cases. So the first week's data was sort of thrown away, and the teams got a lot better at identifying and reporting only new cases, but I think there is that desire to, if you know about a child who's been separated, try to include that and telescope that into the data. And finally, you know, there may well be security concerns for focal points in certain areas, especially if you're looking at military recruitment or trafficking or some other very sensitive situations. We were lucky that, you know, we didn't have any issues in our settings. So the next step for this strand of work is obviously to continue with the analysis and the findings, to really continue unpacking the findings between the different households and see what's going on there, and to think about piloting ideally in more of an acute onset emergency to see whether the same patterns hold, to see what the issues are, and how well this can actually be used for advocacy, fundraising, and programming purposes. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hi, I'm not only the post-lunch speaker, I'm also the final speaker of the day, so I feel like I'm doomed, but I'll give it my best. As you can tell, I have a background in wildlife conservation, but somewhere along the line, I switched from wildlife to children. I'm not sure how that happened, but after having children of my own, I realized there really wasn't that much of a difference, especially now that they're teenagers. But anyway, so I work for RETRAC. I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer. This report that I'm going to be telling you about was done by a woman named Jo Wakia, who is RETRAC's Research and Monitoring Advisor, and she's based in Nairobi. She couldn't make it today, so she asked me to come in her place. So I came up from Washington to do it. This is not my field of expertise, but I've gone over it and over and over it with Jo. I'm going to try to channel her. If I start to talk with a British accent, that's why. So, and I have some notes, so hopefully I'll do my best. So I'll start with who we are. We work with street kids in Africa. Our vision is a world where no child is forced to live on the streets. Our strategy is family reintegration and alternative care. We're 20 years old. We're in 5 countries: Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, and Uganda. And last year we worked with over 18,000 beneficiaries. This is our model, the framework for everything we do. It's really in 3 stages. The first stage is enabling contact, and what that means is the social workers go into the slums and meet up with the children in their space, and we introduce them to our projects and what we do, and we invite them to learn more about us. The second stage is the facilitating attachment. That is in our centers. We have health and wellness program, nutrition program, counseling, sports, overnight shelter. And it's at that stage that we first contact the families when it's appropriate, and we work with both the children and the families. It's a journey for everybody, and that's where we reintegrate them back in their homes. And then the final stage is ensuring success continues, and all that means is that we place a huge emphasis on follow-up. So the study I'm going to tell you about in just a little while, it incorporates all 3. It's for all 3 of those stages. So RETRAC came up with some standard operating procedures for reintegration a while ago, and the purpose of this slide is just to illustrate that the standard operating procedures are a combination of RETRAC's own experiences and values, documented good practice of other organizations in the field, and international standards and guidelines such as the UN guidelines for alternative care, the CRC, that kind of thing. And that it's a dynamic project. I don't know how to do it. Oops, no, I've really done it. I can't hit play, but if I could hit play, those things would all move around, and that's just a way of showing you that it's a living document. It's dynamic. We're constantly reviewing and revising it. Oh, there it goes. Did I do that?
It's a combination.
Okay. So we have 4 principles with our SOPs. The first is that we see the family as the first priority. That's directly linked to the UN guidelines. We're child-centered. We have a child protection policy. We try to do whatever's best for the child. We follow the attachment theory. We believe in a positive, caring adult standing with the child in their journey through life. and we believe in providing community support. And that's the trickiest of our principles, because the children, when we return them to their homes, they're dispersed. We'll have one child here, another child there, another child there. So it's hard to work with communities. What we have to do when the social worker returns a child to a village, he or she will have to very quickly work up a community support, and that can be churches, schools, community centers, that kind of thing. And so we have 5 key steps. I'm not going to go through them, but I'd like to point out that placement, which is reintegration, which is the heart of what we do, is at the center of the process. There's a lot of work that goes on beforehand, which is working with the children and working with the families. And then there's a lot of work that goes on afterwards, which is the follow-up, the family support, and then a structured phase out. And there's no timing for this. It takes as long as it takes. It can take just a few weeks for some children. It can take months and months for others. So now I'm going to talk about the actual study. We did a pilot study in 2011 and 2012 in Uganda and Ethiopia using the Child Status Index. I think most of you are probably familiar with it, probably more familiar than I was up until about a week ago. But there are 12 measurable goals: food security, nutrition and growth, shelter, care, abuse and exploitation, legal protection, wellness, health care, emotional health, social behavior, education performance, and education access. So each of these measurable goals is given a score of good, fair, bad, or very bad. And we did this over 5 time cohorts. Our baseline was when the children were still on the streets or had just entered our programs. Then we did another one at placement, and then we tried to do 3 follow-up at approximately 6-month intervals. So the limitations were, this was a pilot period, so it was a novelty to everybody on our staff, and so there was a few little glitches with data collection, which I'll show you when I show you the actual results. You'll very obviously see where the glitches were. Small sample size, and that's because it was a 2-year pilot program, but as I said before, it can take months and months for a child to go through the program. So we wanted to study the same child from the minute they came off the streets till they had been reintegrated, and we could follow up with them. So even though it was a 2-year period, which is a long time to do a study, it wasn't quite long enough to get a huge number. So we got 24 kids in Ethiopia and 29 kids in Uganda that fit that time period. There were some problems with the Child Status Index because it was not designed to work for street children. It was designed by measure evaluation in East Africa, but for OBC, but not specifically for street children. So there was a little bit of problem there, which we tried to adapt. And then, of course, we can't take full credit for the changes that happened in well-being in the children during the time we had them, but we can take partial credit, I think. So these are the actual results. This is Ethiopia, and these are spider diagrams. The one on the far left is the well-being of children when they're on the streets, the baseline. In the middle is placement, and then on the right is the follow-up for 6 months. And the 12 axes of the circle are the 12 goals of the measurement. For example, 1A is food security, 1B is nutrition and growth. And then the lines going from the center up to the outside of the circle, those are these 4 measurements of good, fair, bad, or very bad. So for example, if you start at the middle and you go up to 1A, it's very bad in the center, and then you add on to that the bad, and then you add on the fair, and then you add on the good. It's a terrific way to visually see the effect that our program has on these children. Some things I want to point out are, on the streets, the 2A and 2B are very bad, and that, of course, is self-explanatory. They don't have shelter if they're street children, and they don't have an adult caring for them. There's also food insecurity, legal problems. If you move to placement and then in follow-up, our goal is to have no orange and no red. There's no red at the end here, but there's still some orange, and that was really important for us to know, because the orange there is the education and psychosocial health. So that told us that's something that we need to work on. Work with maybe the schools in the areas where we return them. So this is the same thing for Uganda, and this is what I was talking about earlier. The missing information is because we didn't instruct the social workers who were doing the surveys properly, and they thought that, for example, the 6A is the education. They thought the retract teachers were going to collect that information, and they thought the retract nurse was going to collect the information about their physical health. But so it was a miscommunication. But even with that, you can still see there's a lot of red and orange when they're living on the streets, and then they get much, much better as they move through our program. Still some areas that are slow. And again, it's still the education and the psychosocial health. Also here in Uganda, 3B is legal protection. And in Uganda, to go to school, you're required to have an ID card. In Ethiopia, you're not. So it's hard to get an ID card for a former street child. So that's something we need to work on so that we can get these children enrolled in school. So this is just a summary of everything I've just said, and I hope I haven't forgotten anything. Children's well-being has improved, obviously. Education is slower to improve. Emotional health and social behavior is slower to improve, especially in Ethiopia. And in Uganda, there's still concern, food security, shelter, legal protection. So then this is where we borrowed this graph from a professor at the University of Manchester. And he did a study in South Africa of seniors, retirees, and how they fared with pension benefits and whatnot, whites versus blacks. So we borrowed that with the help of the Brooks World Poverty Institute, and we changed it and did a frequency distribution for children, street children. So the horizontal axis are the 12 measured goals of the CSI. Those are the deprivations, and then the vertical axis is the percent of children who have that number of deprivations or fewer. So deprivations are really just the red and the orange. That's all we are counting on this one. So the best example is to say go to the 50% line, and that would be 50% of the children. So if you go across and you hit the streets baseline, you'll see that 50% of the children on the streets have 5 deprivations or more. And then if you keep going across to the yellow, the placement line, 50% of the children who are at the placement stage have 2 deprivations or more. And then if you keep going across, it gets fewer. So obviously the further right you go, the better off a child is. And then we could disaggregate it by the data by different factors. For example, this is by age, and this shows you that the older children are slightly better off than the younger children. And this is all just on the streets. From here on in, it's going to only be kids on the streets. So this shows us that the older children are better off. Probably they're a little bit better at problem solving or finding work, or they can just get along better on the streets. This is how long they were in school in Ethiopia before they went to the streets. There's probably a strong correlation with age, but again, you can see the longer a child has been in school, the better off he or she is. And this is the time on the streets. This is time on the streets. So the longer a child, once he gets to the streets, the longer he's been there, the harder, the more deprivations he has. But it's also harder to reintegrate a child that's been on the streets for longer. And that has to do with they're more ingrained in street life, drug abuse, gang culture, that kind of thing. So a lesson that we took away from this one was get to the children when they're young, get to the children as quickly as you can when they get on the streets. And then the final graph is, this was very interesting. Wakiso is the area around Kampala, and Kampala is where our project is. So we wanted to know if having family nearby was any benefit to a street child, even if he was living on the streets. Did he get any benefit from having family in the neighborhood? And the answer was no. And it's the same with Ethiopia. We did the same thing for Addis Ababa, same thing. So we had a lot of takeaways from this. One is with the color charts where the red and orange got smaller and smaller, family reintegration works, and we should invest in it. The second one, outreach is critical to reach the younger children and those who have recently arrived. Reintegration programs, we need to focus more on education skills and the psychosocial support, especially we learned in Ethiopia with girls need more psychosocial support than the boys do. And monitoring children's well-being during the reintegration process is the key to ensuring that placement remains in their best interests and programs can respond to needs. And what that means is we monitor them from the baseline of when they're on the streets till many months after follow-up, and we've been continuing to do that, so it's important for us. And that's all. Thank you.
I don't know if you have more detail on the reasons why the children were on the streets and the process of family reintegration, and thinking if there were issues in the family that led to the children being on the streets, what was the process like for reintegrating them in the families, and was that always, I don't know, that's not always successful.
That's a loaded question. When we work with the children, we work with the whole child. So we do. That was a very quick study, but what we do is we look at the entire family situation, and as I said in the beginning, it's a journey for the child and it's a journey for the family, and so it's individually tailored to each child. So, for example, as it's been said over and over again today, poverty is such a factor. So we work with families, and we have income-generating activities that might help with that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
okay.
It's complicated.
It is very complicated. That's the answer. Yeah.
Okay, I know you talked about poverty, but a follow-up. What are like the kind of the main factors that are driving the street? Is it families that are, as I say, have already experienced street life? What are the issues that are driving some of the children to the street?
Well, there are several push factors. It could be poverty. It could be death of a parent, or a step-parent sometimes kicks a child out. It could be a lot of kids leave home because they can't go to school, and so, or they leave home because they need to go earn. The family tells them to go earn money because they're so poor. So usually there's more than one factor. There's almost always there's not just because of one thing, but it's a combination of things.
So the issue of poverty has come up a couple of times, and I think it's important that we make a distinction between poverty as an attribute of the family. Family doesn't have a lot of money. Poverty as an attribute of a community, and the intersection of the two. Being poor in a poor community is one thing. Being poor in a non-poor community is entirely different. And I wonder how much of poverty, when we say poverty, is really poverty of place, not the person may be poor, but the poverty effect may be more about the context in which a family's poverty is lived out. So the social supports available to a family where there's concentrated poverty, urban poverty in the U.S., for example, is very different than the experience of poverty in a community that is more economically heterogeneous. And I don't think we've done enough in the child protection business to tease out the effect of poverty as an attribute of place, poverty as an attribute of person or family, as the case may be, and the intersection between the two as a vulnerability. And I think if we, in the U.S., where we've teased that apart, we find that maltreatment disparities and placement disparities are smaller in places with high poverty. And the conventional explanation is that disparity is worse in places of high poverty, and that empirically is not at all supported by the data.
Peter?
Fred, I was wondering about your comment in passing about the NGOs having disincentives to do well. Is that because if they don't do so well and they keep having to place children in foster care, they stay in business? They couldn't change their business model, no?
It's very hard to change your business model if policy has you going in one direction and finances have you going in another direction. And if you can't convert the money you have in the service the public sector no longer wants to buy, and you can't get the money out of that service and into something else because there are rules that prohibit that from happening in a very sort of dynamic, proactive way, it becomes very difficult for even public sector entities where there's a governing body. It's very difficult to re-engineer the system without re-engineering the logic that drives cash flow. And it's easy to overplay the biological metaphor here, but if you don't nourish parts of the system, they will die off. And if you continue to nourish parts of the system, they won't die off. And so managing, money is what nourishes the system. That's how organizations survive. And if you want the organization to do something different, you have to nourish something different. If you don't be surprised if things don't change.
I wanted to ask you, what do you do with the families when you're reunifying the kids back to them? Because I was struck by you saying even when they have family in close proximity, when they're on the street, it doesn't do anything for them.
Mhm.
But somehow you make that relationship start to work. So what are you doing to make that?
I can't tell you exactly. We're a professional social work organization, so we put a lot of emphasis on counseling. So we do counseling with the family. I'm not a social worker, so
Yeah.
I'm one of the few people that's probably not. But so I can't.
But economic strengthening is
Economic
probably part
strengthening
of
is
it.
definitely
Okay.
part of it. Yeah.
But you're working with both parts. It's not like just working with the child. It's really doing something direct with the
Oh
family.
yeah, we work with the whole family and community, everything we can.
I just mention a potentially interesting resource that you may not be familiar with. It's a report that comes out of an interagency process that's actually ongoing. It's called Reaching for Home. If you do a Google search for that, you'll probably find it. It was a review of children's reintegration into family care across a number of different areas of practice. What some of us have observed is that you have some agencies that do work with street children around reintegration. You've got other children or other organizations that in humanitarian emergencies are working on reunifying separated children. You've got some organizations that work with former child soldiers and reintegrating them. You've got some that work with trafficked children on reintegration. And so it looked at what literature, and mostly it was gray literature, and did interviews with experts in those different areas to find out what were the similarities, commonalities at the various stages of the reintegration process. And I think where I see the community going, we used to talk more about reunification, and now the focus is much more, and reunification is seen as maybe a point in time, but reintegration is seen as an ongoing process that requires intervention. So Reaching for Home, I think, is an interesting piece of work, and out of that, the next stage is to try to develop some international guidelines that hopefully would have ultimately some recognition on the issue of children from immigration in the family.
And it's on the Better Care Network website. Just so that I help you
So
find
that's go to BCN and look for it. Yes, please.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the two pieces of work that you're doing, one more in a development context, one more in an emergency context. And the one in development context probably more closely or easily fits the debate on child protection systems. And the one in emergency probably not as easily. How do you see parallels in terms of system building between the two? Do you think it's possible to build structures and data systems that would then support child protection systems, even in emergencies, and link it to development context?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a lot of ways that the two data systems could speak to each other and could inform each other. I mean, from the national statistical side, I think the more we know about these vulnerable populations, where they are, who they are, how many there are, and thinking about responding and systems building to protect those, I mean, those children, I think they are going to end up being more protected if an emergency hits. So I think in terms of preventative care and you know, creating a system that will protect children better if an emergency hits, I see a clear linkage there. I see another linkage, this is a conversation that Florence and I have had with many others around the emergency tool. What is it trying to capture? Is it enough to just try to capture the situation of children who are separated by an emergency? What about those children who have been previously separated, do they not count also? Do they not need resources also? So I think in this way, in theory, the national data that would be collected would speak to that other missing piece from what we're looking at collecting in the emergency estimation.
I'd like to, oh, Martin, did you want to
Sure,
address that?
yeah. Thanks for the great presentations. I had another question for Joan regarding the assessment of kids' reintegration over a year period. Were there any cases of kids leaving home again, and how were those cases treated?
Yeah, we have a retention rate, or they stay in their homes about 70% of the time. So some of the children do leave, and like I said earlier, they the longer they've been on the streets, the more they get ingrained into the street culture, the harder it is to return them, and the harder it is for them to stay in a home, in a family setting, and also to go back to school and all that. So.
But did the number of I don't know, did the number of follow-up visits affect the chances of separating again?
I don't think that it did. The follow-up, on the thing I said we do 6-month follow-ups, but really we try to do 6-month follow-ups, but it just varies by where the child is located. But no, that doesn't make a difference. And they do follow-ups. If a social worker feels that the child is under stress and may be leaving again, then they'll spend more time visiting the families.
Okay, I have an additional question. You said that the girls tend to need additional support. Why do you think that there's a difference between the boys and the girls?
Probably it has to do with the girls' backgrounds of why they left, why they're on the streets. There's always the danger of more sexual exploitation with girls. Okay. And that was actually only in Ethiopia that we found that.
Okay, only in Ethiopia?
Yeah.
No,
I have a few questions. One is on the retract data. Yes, thank you all for these presentations. First of all, is it self-reported? I do know the CSI, and I think actually the CSI is used in like the community caregiver programming, and are you asking the children themselves, or are you asking the caregivers, since that's a question we were looking at earlier today?
That's interesting because the CSI was not designed for street kids. It was designed for OVC that had family that you could ask the caregivers, but they didn't have caregivers for us to ask. So we did have to tweak it a little bit, and our social workers had to get some of the information, especially at baseline, from the actual children themselves.
From the kids themselves, so that's how you're asking. The other thing is that it just really resonates with me. There's a lot of research done with the homeless populations in the United States, and in essence, once a person's been homeless for 6 months, they self-identify as homeless, and then even when housing is offered, it contradicts this sense of identity that's been developed, and that's so just thinking, it just makes a lot of sense to me that the longer a child's been on the street, the more difficult it is.
And these are just children that come into our program, but for every child that comes into our program, how many hundreds are out there that aren't even interested in working with us?
The second one is kind of bringing both Lindsay's and Fred's presentations together. And if I've understood the data sources correctly, Fred, you were showing us trend lines that are from individual cases. Like you're able to aggregate all of the children entering, leaving, foster care, being placed, etc. And Lindsay, the community surveillance tool does that, but anything around prevalence is not. That's surveys. So I guess the question to me is, how close are we in a place like DRC to having any kind of information management system that would allow you to, well, first, I guess the question is, Fred, would you then use this data to go back? You would never use it to go back and find individual children, would you? Are you
No, you absolutely would. Yeah, no, you absolutely would.
You would, okay.
Sure. It's sort of it's the equivalent of a electronic medical record. So you know what you know in the data, and you're trying to use that to anticipate what could or could not happen next. And how do you use that information clinically in the context of all of the other kids who you were looking at who've been in similar situations. So when you go to the doctor, you know, for a serious for a serious illness, life-threatening illness, the question most on the minds of people is, what are my chances?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Based on what you know about me, clinically, what are my chances? 5 years from now, where am I going to be? And that's a relevant question for parents who have their children removed from their home. The first meeting with the social worker, they might have on their minds, what are the chances I'll get my child back? And the number of social workers who can provide a statistically valid estimate of that is very small. And we as middle class, upper middle class people would never tolerate from our physician, although it may be in fact true, the inability to provide a statistically reliable answer to our question, what are my chances? But the answer to that question is embedded in these data systems. I mean, you can go in there and you can say, you know, if your child was admitted within the first 3 months of life, you have a 40% chance of getting them back. There's a 60% chance they will leave the system with a new set of legal parents. That's the reality of it. And how do you use that information to make, you know, does this family I'm working with fit the profile of a family who gets their kids back, given that they belong to this actuarial class? Or do they look more like the family whose kids are getting adopted? And why shouldn't the answer to that question be part of the case planning, the formation of a treatment plan, all those things? So not only can you, the fact that we don't, there are a number of reasons why, but there's really no, at the present time, there's really no expectation at the clinical level that the information would be used for precisely those kinds of purposes.
Then another question, you know, you showed the states with, you know, certain groupings of laws versus others. Have there been any examples of successful advocacy to get the states with the worst outcomes to adopt the laws that have
No,
better
because
outcomes?
it's really the first time data like that has been presented where we're able to categorize state laws and say these are states that have strong, you know, pro-adoption policies, let's call it that way, or less pro-adoption policies, whatever that counterpoint to that is. And it's really the first, so we've got the laws categories. That was work done by Bill Vesnesky at the University of Washington, and we've just put it together with our ability to say, well, you know, and I didn't show the slide, the amount of variability in the likelihood of adoption is stunning, between state. And then when you look at within state, and so the laws are designed to create contexts that promote behavior and to some extent uniformity of case handling processes. And given that that's the intent of the law, the fact that there's so much diversity is just stunning. And then when you think about, to your point, okay, I'm a legislator, and I want to do something pro-adoption, and I have no idea about how the current configuration of policy produces a set of adoption outcomes. I could actually be adding policy, which means adding work at the case level, that could actually make things worse, even though it's intended to make things better. And so the fact that we don't know how policy aligns with the process itself, let alone whether or not any one of those particular patterns does in fact deliver the well-being outcome that it's really intended to, you know, we haven't made any connection there. But the idea that the policy is thought to create homogeneity in human experience, and the data suggests that it doesn't create homogeneity, and it could well actually promote heterogeneity in a way that's sort of counter to the intent of policymakers. And that's really where the advantage that we have, because the U.S. in my lifetime, my career, has literally invested billions of dollars into tracking where these kids are. And now making meaning of that billions of dollars worth of investment is really sort of the scientific challenge of the day, and connecting it to well-being, connecting it to, should you do this, we would talk about, well, what happens if the best outcomes are in the states that have the least policy, the skinniest policy framework, the thinnest policy framework? How do we get legislatures to take away public policy that may actually be interfering. So these are the dynamics. So much of the conversation, rightfully so, is about the human experience, because that's ultimately what we're trying to affect. But the system effects and how policy alters structures and how structures define opportunity and how experience is modified by opportunity and structure. Those are the sort of scientific questions that when you have the data, you've got to figure out how to answer those questions.
And I guess the follow-on question to Lindsay, this data from DRC seems very much destined to the humanitarian community, which is fine. That's where the demand for this work came from. And in many ways, the humanitarian community, from what I can tell, acts as a parallel or surrogate government in DRC. I'm on record here, but yeah, I do believe that. At least another sphere of action that isn't always well integrated, or is rarely well integrated with what the government's doing. And, is there thinking in this project, or what's the hope that doing this kind of work would spur some longer term surveillance or data collection or information systems in the long term in Congo?
It's a good question. I think the systems, I do think that this is really targeted for humanitarian communities to be able to use more after, again, really not even for a conflict situation like the DRC, but more of a rapid onset situation, to be able to target funds and program appropriately in a targeted way. I think the other strand of work around the national surveillance, I think that's where we're looking to go deeper, think about ways for more sustainable routine data collection. But I think some of these, especially around the community surveillance, these are mechanisms that could last, that could subsist, that could be built upon to collect ongoing data long after a conflict ends. And so I think that's the piece more than the estimation part, where we would think about longer term data effects.
Just follow up on that. And one distinction that I would also make between, you were trying to compare the sources of data that, for example, Fred used and what surveillance data brings in. I want to point out that the surveillance data that we are collecting is not case-based, in the sense of it's not a case-finding system, even though hopefully it will act as one in the limited areas where we set up our surveillance system. But it's not, the initial idea is for us to capture trends, and hopefully you design your sample such that you stratified well enough to be able to cover different areas, so that if they're increasing numbers, then you can go and investigate more, rather than the data that Fred used, which is all based on individual cases. And a system already exists to capture those cases, record the information about them, and then someone like Fred can take it and use it. So
which the humanitarian world has a little bit in the CPIMS, the Child Protection Information Management System, but it's widely recognized that that's an incomplete system. So we do have much more complete information that's more akin to the kind of data systems that Fred's talking about, but it's also very incomplete and missing, likely systematically, different kinds of cases of separation and
Right, and I think the important point to remember is that 50 years ago, the foster care system in the U.S. was in exactly the same place. It was a surveillance system. They didn't do person counts. They went out and did the census was a little bit easier to do because you had an idea of where the kids were. But the thing that instigated all of the data collection, the federal money that went into it, was a report in 1980 or 79 called Children Without Homes, where they went out and they found out that the states that had removed children couldn't tell you where they were. They didn't know where, and so somebody said, if the state's going to take responsibility for the kid, they ought to know where they're living. Right? That's sort of like a basic responsibility. So it was a very primitive surveillance system in the day, and then the discontinuity between the public having assumed a set of responsibilities under child protection law and its ability to effectively account for its intrusion into the family was what created and so I think it's that gap and the role that information has between one's sense of a duty and one's ability to comment on how faithful your duty has been executed, and the idea that systematically gathered data is the only way that we have to reliably and in a transparent way document whether or not we do what we say we do. And the evolution from that sort of primordial set of insights over a long period of time, as people persist, want to be more accurate, they'll go from cross-sectional data, it'll evolve into longitudinal data, some of the issues that we talked about in terms of, what would the ideal data set look like. But it's an evolutionary process, and again, we're fortunate in this country to have the spare cash, if you will, to invest in information. But it nevertheless was an evolutionary process here as well.
Well, following up on that, to me, with all the presentation we had today, we looked at different data, different research, looking at different bits. And there's this question of actually how these different bits connect at the end into a system, and do they, and we know that more often they don't. We're collecting data because we have a program and we need the data. USAID, UNICEF are collecting data because they also need some baseline data. We're doing research because maybe we have a humanitarian group that's interested in understanding better how to spend their money in emergency. So these various research and data initiatives continue to be fairly isolated from one another, but what they don't seem to be doing is becoming a whole, which actually enables the duty bearers, which we started to talk at the beginning of the day with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the states that have undertaken precisely what Fred is saying, to actually take a point in time. So how do we get there, is my question. How do we get to, not necessarily the ideal data situation, but how do we get to a point where these various pieces of research and data system fit into a system that enables the states, the duty bearers, to actually do their job better?
Yeah, I've been pondering essentially the same question. It goes back to my original subtext, out of sight, out of mind. And in the most of the world, in most middle and low-income countries, nobody really knows how many children are outside of family care. Maybe there's been an agency study of, but very few have systems to enumerate, much less assess the situation of children outside of family care. Why is that? If we're going to get from where we are to where we need to be, why is it that governments are not sufficiently motivated to do this? And I'm asking that in a serious way, because evidence suggests that they're not. Maybe it isn't that they don't care, but they're not sufficiently motivated to say, all right, we need to know this. But why is that? And I think in order to develop the systems, there needs to be a level of motivation, commitment on the part of governments to get there, and we're not anywhere close to that now. So anybody want to speculate on?
Well, I would venture to say that the awareness that there's a public responsibility, that's a burden of the government, is a relatively new idea, even in the U.S. For a long time, in a good number of states and in a place like New York City, the private sector has a huge role in taking care of kids who can't live at home. And it's only been, over the last 40 or 50 years where the public sector has asserted a very specific role. Now it's evolving, and it reached something of a tipping point in the mid-'60s, but it's a recent invention in some respects, even in this country. And so the idea in the developing world, where you're emerging from in cultures where the responsibility for children is decentralized in its many forms, the idea that there is a responsibility, that there are calamities for which there ought to be a central responsibility, and that ought to be the government. I think that's a relatively recent notion in you know, in the grand sweep of time. And so then that realization followed by, okay, now that we're holding the bag, what do we do about it? That again, it's part of the process of managing the gap between what you're supposed to know about and what you're actually going to do about it. So I think that's a big part of it. I think where we feel it acutely because, in a sense, where we know how that plays out over time, we can already see the end game. And so we want to impose the end game on developing countries far earlier in their natural process than would otherwise be the case if there weren't a bunch of people around who did know how this is going to play out. And you know, and that's the politics of it all. It's like, what, you know, how is this going to play out, and do we invest in that if that's not the way it's going to play out? Because we have scarce resources, and we want to be sure that whatever resources we put forward to these kinds of monitoring activities is actually properly located in a central government and then dispersed back down through. So I think it's the relative newness of these ideas that account for the discontinuity between what we see as possible, what is the responsibility, and what actually emerges in different cultures.
I have, I mean, you could say it's a little bit of a tangent, but I think there is a lot of data which is collected, but the problem because of the rates, let's say for example, you've got a lot of program data by agencies that are providing, let's say, an intervention or a program, let's say in Cote d'Ivoire. A lot of data is collected on those kids over a period of time, 5 years. Within the same country, you can have another agency, another NGO collecting data using the same indicators or for a period of time, because it's standardized, you have to do measure. Imagine if somebody was collecting those data and merging those data, you get a much better on a regular, consistent basis. Because if you look at that, I had reviewed, done some work at Cote d'Ivoire, I've also done some work for Ethiopia. Similar data was being collected. You can actually merge and you can start comparing countries if there's an effort to start threading through. And I mean, the quality of data will still be challenging, but still be able to have some sort of baseline data across the countries if there's a need. But some of that data sits and no one merges that information together.
If I could follow on Fred's comment just quickly, we need to just. One of my assumptions would be that governments don't really want to know numbers about children outside of family care if they don't feel that they have the capacity to do anything about it. So, you know, that I think that's a factor. One thing we observed a number of years ago in Zambia, where there were a lot of figures that had been bandied about for years about children, street children. And you know, really large numbers. Some of the advocates were saying, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of street children in this country. We're not doing anything. We need more money. And then they actually started a night count process of going out counting heads, how many children were sleeping on the street at night, and found the numbers were actually much, much smaller than what any. And that really changed some of the governmental perception. Well, this isn't such an overwhelming problem. It is potentially something we could do about. So, and I think potentially there is a role for some these kinds of enumeration exercises where we begin to quantify and characterize an issue to say, well, it is possible to do something, and you know, here's some evidence. Anyway, Mark, how do we need to cut off?
Last thought, and then we'll take a short break.
Oh, okay. Also, I think the issue of what kind of indicators, like adding process indicators. I was in Uganda and we were going around to some orphanages and reception centers, and the work we do is quality improvement. And the reception center, the improvement aim is to reduce the time for returning children to their families when the family is known. And even though sometimes the family is known, it takes over 2 years to get that child back into their home because the paperwork is not complete. So we've been working with the reception center to get photos of the children, to get their charts in order, so that then it can go to the government process. But then they found, looking at their data of correct records, it looked beautiful. You know, they were increasing their compliance with, Uganda has their standards for institutional care, and so it goes up, but the documentation from the probation officers, the police that dropped the child off, was remaining at this flat line, very low. So it introduced the idea of, we need to get all these people together so that these other people understand the importance of this kind of data and getting the children back into their homes. So I think that the usefulness of data, saying like, can you do something with it, I think is really important to show a very concrete use of data for how we can improve care through the data that the people are collecting.